Going. Well, hi everyone and welcome. I'm Casey Vincent and I'm the Director of Events for PACE. So I'd like to welcome you all to today's community chat presented by Grupo NGN, what you need to know about Florida Senate Bill 1120. And our speaker today is Isaac Schloss. He's the Chief Technology Officer for Grupo NGN and the Vice Chair of the PACE Government Affairs Committee. And he's also the newest member of the PACE Board of Directors. So as it goes through our presentation today, please feel free to ask any questions that you have in the Q&A window, and then we'll get to as many as we can. So with that, I will go ahead and turn it over to Isaac.
Thank you, Casey. I'm going to go ahead and start my presentation here. So I will, as the video loads for you guys, thank you, Casey, for that introduction. And yes, my name is Isaac Schloss. And before I get started, I want to thank PACE for partnering with Grupo NGN to provide this presentation to you all. I know there's a mix of customers that we've invited who may not be familiar with PACE and PACE members who possibly aren't familiar with Grupo NGN. Hopefully we can address both of those in this presentation. For those of you who aren't familiar with PACE, PACE is the only nonprofit organization dedicated exclusively to the advancement of companies that use a multi-channel contact center approach to engage their customers. I know that's a mouthful, but essentially what it comes down to is that at PACE, our job, or our mission, I should say, is to help keep our member base informed in best practices, regulatory changes, provide networking, and so much more. So I'm a proud PACE member. You may see that hashtag in some of my posts on social media if you're one of my followers. And I am very proud of the work that I've been able to start doing here at PACE over the last couple of years. Grupo NGN is my day job. PACE is a largely volunteer organization. So my day job is the CTO Grupo NGN, as Casey mentioned. And my job there is really to improve the customer experience and try to take business needs and turn them into standard features. That said, who is Grupo NGN? For those of you who aren't familiar with us, we're not Groupon. So I'm going to start and just clear that up. A lot of people, for some reason, hear Grupo NGN and just say, oh, that's Groupon. But that is not who we are. We are an enterprise contact center software product house. Our core manufactured solution is NGN CloudComm, which is a full omni-channel contact center solution. So we compete in the same space as companies like Five9, Noble, companies like that. Our executive leadership team averages 20 to 30 years experience in the contact center industry. I personally have been in the contact center industry for well over 20 years. I've spent at least 15 years on the customer side working in BPOs. So I have much more experience being a consumer of this product than I have as the seller of it. We provide a lot of solutions for the contact center, gamification, PBX services, and so on. At the root of what we try to do, we try to make sure that our software adapts to your needs. So when new things come out, like these Florida regulations, we try to come up with solutions for that. If you've never heard of Grupo NGN, I mentioned we've been on the market for 20 years or 20 plus years. Reasons for that is our name has changed a couple of times. SES was the company that originally developed our product. We were later acquired by Siemens, who also acquired SCR. And after about 10 years, our CEO bought us back from them. So quick recap of who we are. If nothing else, just to show that we're not some company that just formed overnight to try to sell to contact centers. We've been living and breathing this industry probably as long as many of you on this call. So I've told you who Grupo NGN is. Let me tell you what Grupo NGN is not. We are not a company that provides legal advice. So I'm going to give you the standard spiel that if you've gone to any of Michelle's presentations and things like that, you've also heard something similar. The information contained in this presentation is provided for informational purposes only, and it should not be construed as legal advice. And I cannot stress this last part enough. You should not act on any information presented herein without first seeking qualified legal counsel. I think that's a very important thing for everybody on this call to keep in mind, is make sure that if you get taken to court, the person who's going to represent you is comfortable with the approach you're taking to doing business. If you don't have qualified legal counsel that specializes in this type of law, the PACE catalog has plenty of great resources. You're welcome to reach out to me or anybody at PACE, and we can try to help point you towards somebody who really knows this stuff inside and out. All right, so enough background. Let's talk about why we're all here. We're here because of a new law in Florida. So if, and I don't want to say a new law, a new bill that is passed. If you're a current customer of mine, I'm going to show you how you could leverage your current system without needing any patches to conform to this law. For those of you who aren't my customers, hopefully this is an approach that you can go to your current vendors with and say, hey, listen, we need to be able to meet these laws. It's possible, again, assuming your legal team is good with that or your compliance team is good with that. But here's some ideas that we've seen with other people. Obviously, we're always open to new customers. So if you want to talk to us about our solution, feel free to reach out to us. But again, this is more just showing our approach that we're advising our customers to take. And hopefully this will work for everybody here. So a fun fact about this bill in Florida, there were about 4 or 5 similar bills that were introduced all at once this year. All had similar goals, and this was not a partisan attack on the industry. Both sides, the Republicans and Democrats, both introduced this legislation, and PACE was monitoring it. And this is part of what PACE does. We monitor bills as they're introduced. We try to advocate for changes or reach out to lawmakers and say, hey, we support this, when that rarely, but occasionally does happen. So we were monitoring this and all the other Florida bills. We have some members in the state of Florida who have close ties with what's going on there in the state. And this was basically just sitting in a committee, sitting dead. And they said, this isn't even on the agenda. And this is about April 10th. I was talking to one of our members. They said, you know what, this isn't even on the agenda. And the session ends April 30th. So I don't see this getting voted on. I don't see this getting passed. I don't think we need to worry. So we all took a deep breath, exhaled, and then it got put on the agenda something like April 15th. And by April 27th or somewhere in that neighborhood, it was voted on and it was passed unanimously. There wasn't a single nay. So this, even if the governor wanted to veto this, clearly this was strongly desired by the lawmakers, so they could have overrode his veto power. So once this passed, we didn't really have a chance to do anything about it. Now, what makes matters worse is that the bill was signed into law on June 30th, the day before it was supposed to take effect. So this bill went into effect July 1st. This is already a thing. So if you weren't even aware of this and you do business in the state of Florida, pay extra attention. So what's in this bill? This isn't necessarily, and I tried to clarify this earlier, this isn't exactly a new law, whereas I guess to be more specific, it is an amendment to the current regulations that are in place. A lot of it is to either their Consumer Protection Act that they've got in Florida or their telemarketing, their version of the TSR that they've got in that state. The bill was very confusing because it affects multiple sections of the Florida state statute. So some people that were reading this bill initially said, oh, well, you know what? I'm exempt from this because it exempts this, and this, and essentially exempted almost anybody that would make a call. But it turns out that when you actually look at that and then read the amendments in line with the current statute, the exemptions applied to something completely different, like registration or something like that. So there's a lot in this bill. There are a lot of changes. I'm going to focus on what I identified as the 5 key items that would affect the vast majority of people in the state. Again, if your legal team hasn't done any research on this bill, I do recommend a full review so you can see all of the changes. But I think these are the 5 most critical that people should be pointing at. So what are these new things that are in effect here? Well, first, we've got the fact that we have to stop calling at 8 p.m. market time. So previously, Florida allowed calling in line with federal regulations where you can call from 8 a.m. to 9 p.m. Market time. This changes that to stop calling an hour earlier. They prohibit telemarketers from displaying a different caller identification number than the number the call is originating from to conceal the true identity of the caller. Now, that's a mouthful, but I'm reading that verbatim intentionally. We will talk about that in more detail later. Restricting call attempts to 3 within a 24-hour period of time. Requires express written consent to call a Florida subscriber automatically. We're going to talk more about that. And then they add a provision for private right of action of up to $1,500 per violation. There are other maximums if they could prove damage. I mean, again, when we think, and I'm going to be careful to not talk about TCPA a lot, because I've heard a lot of people call this the Florida TCPA. And I think that's a dangerous statement to make. TCPA, a lot of people think, oh, that means something about cell phones. Yes, there is stuff in the TCPA about cell phones. The TCPA covers much, 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 much more than that. So I don't want to confuse it with that for that and many other reasons. However, with TCPA, when we talk about the private right of action stuff with cell phones that came up over the last 6 years, a big part of everybody's stress from that was the fact that they could get dinged for any time a cell phone ring. And it would be easy to argue and say, well, I didn't cause anybody damage. I mean, I'm sure just about everybody on this call, just like me, has an unlimited plan. So there's not a financial cost assigned to it. It's not like I pay for my minutes, and so that took 2 of my minutes and whatever. But if somebody can prove that there has been some damage, or if it's easy for them to go for that number or possibly a little bit higher. I suppose that there are some lesser maximums in place that I've seen in there, where if it was an accident that you broke it, but again, I think that it would be it might be a little difficult to prove that it wasn't a willful violation. So I would just look at it as $1,500 potential every time I break this rule. So who does this rule apply to? Fortunately, this law pertains to any Florida phone number, regardless of physical location. And I want to be careful about that because there are different ways you could interpret how this is written. Let me start with why I say fortunately. While some of this may be scary to you, there are much scarier things being talked about right now that, again, PACE is monitoring and taking action against. A great example of that would be in the state of New York, where they're introducing legislation where they're trying to come up with similar restrictions, and they're saying it applies to anybody when they're in the state of New York. The problem of that, of course, is that if I go to New York on business, vacation, whatever, and somebody calls my cell phone and they're following laws that are allowed for my phone number or for where I live in the country, but not allowed for New York, then they're at fault. Now, the call center calling me could argue, well, I have no way of finding out where that person is. So that becomes scary. With Florida, it's designed to protect Florida numbers. So there is, and I'm going to put this in non-legal terms, there is an assumption in place essentially that any Florida number is covered by that. Now, you could argue that, okay, well, if I live in, let's say I'm from Florida, and I currently live in Phoenix. So let's just pretend I'm from Florida, and I bring my, I'm sorry, I live in Phoenix, but let's pretend I'm from Florida. I bring my Florida phone number with me on my cell phone when I move. I don't change it. I don't update it. An argument could be made that Florida doesn't have the power to create laws to govern me as a resident of Arizona. On the other hand, there could be, based on how numbering plans work, there could be some potential argument there. So again, my opinion, not legal advice, but my opinion is treat any Florida number as though it is covered by this. I would also take it a step further. And I would say that you might want to look at things like if you've got their address on file, take that into consideration. We'll talk about that in a minute. But first, let's talk about just the phone number in general. So when we talk about the phone number is the only piece of information you need to call someone. You don't need to know their name. You don't need to know their address. All you need to do is call them. And we've got this rule where we have to call them from 8 to 8. And that's easy on a lot of systems to limit the time of day calling. But are you aware that Florida is in 2 time zones? A lot of people don't know that. And there are some area codes in the state of Florida, such as 850, that exist in multiple time zones. So if the way you're identifying your phone number, if you're doing it by just the area code, that's not going to be good enough. And that's going to create a larger potential for you because of some of the potential risk because of this private right of action. So how your technology solution identifies and assigns a phone number to a state and time zone is critical. In my research, I found the best way to determine that is with the first 6 digits of a phone number, which is commonly called the NPA NXX. I have researched this time and time again, and to date, NPA NXXs do not cross state lines and do not cross time zones. Whereas in the United States, we have lots and lots of phone numbers or area codes that do. Now, fun fact, just since we're on that topic, 21 states, 21 area codes exist in multiple time zones in the United States. So again, just trying to show the importance of looking at more than just an area code. A great example, I am not from Florida, as I said hypothetically earlier. I'm actually from the Chicagoland area. For a long time, I lived in Northwest Indiana, and that's where I got my current cell phone number. So this has a 219 area code. And the 219 area code is an example of an area code that is in both Central and Eastern time. So be very careful with that. So when you're doing your time zone association, again, depending on the capabilities of your system, make sure you're observing that. In our system, make sure you're tying that to something like the NPA NXX, to where you're looking at those first 6 digits of the phone number to figure out what time zone you are in. Now, keep in mind that time zones aren't good enough because, again, as we've learned here in Florida, many states have their own laws. It's not just 8 a.m. to 9 p.m. Depending on the work you're doing. There's going to be different rules based on where you're at. So make sure that not only are you doing things at a time zone level, but you're also doing things at a state level. So you can look at some, and I've got some of those examples up here, like Rhode Island during the week, Monday through Friday, I have them shutting off at 6 o'clock. And then 5 o'clock on Saturday, notice they're starting a little bit later. So make sure that you're taking those things into consideration when you're calling each of these states and these times. Now, another way, and I talked about this earlier, is the address. If you look at the zip code is another thing that I have found in my research does not cross state lines, does not cross time zones. In fact, the NPA NXX is tied to zip codes. So if you've got the phone number, or I'm sorry, if you've got the address and the address says they're Florida, but the phone number says they're not, you might want to consider looking at that address as the priority. And again, in our software, you can look at both and kind of weight that and decide how you make your decision with whatever product you're using. Make sure you're making those same types of determinations. All right, so let's move on to caller ID. Now, caller ID is fun. When I see something come up, because I've seen a lot of states that are introducing legislation about accurate caller ID, and for the most part, it's harmless. I look at it and I kind of laugh because at the federal level, there's already a lot of legislation in place about what caller ID you have to use, and more importantly, that it has to be accurate. The reason that a lot of states, such as Florida, are putting this in is because now it gives the consumer an avenue to seek, some sort of reparation or something for, or seek damages, I guess, for calls that violate it. Whereas, if the states don't have this, then it's up to the feds, and they've got all these rules for when they'll go after people, and there's got to be this many complaints, and blah blah blah. So the caller ID, or the verbiage for the caller ID changes in Florida is a little scary because, and I'm gonna quote this again. It says you can't use technology that deliberately displays a different caller identification number than the number the call is originating from to conceal the true identity of the caller. Now, there's other provisions in there about, if your technology can block caller ID, you can't do that. But I want to focus more on the trying to conceal your true identity. I've heard some people look at this and say, well, wow, this is really scary. I mean, that must mean that we need to have the caller ID of our call center. Because, I realize there's going to be BPOs on this call. There's going to be people who, outsourcers, people who are in-house contact centers. So if you're in an in-house contact center, you're probably going to have that phone number, that caller ID ring back to you anyway. So you're not going to be as concerned. But if you're an outsourcer, and let's say you're making calls on behalf of, and I'm just picking a name out of the hat, SiriusXM, you might have the contract from SiriusXM to do their outbound calling, but not any inbound caller ID calls. They want those to go to a different contact center that specializes in that. So you say, well, how do I do that? If I'm BPO, if I'm Grupo NGN, Do I now need to give them my caller ID instead? The problem with how I read this is that it says the number the call is originating from. So if we think back to the 1980s, 1990s, where we all had phones in our house, and even before then, when you pick up the phone, you dial a number, people see that you're calling, they know what number you called from because there's a one-to-one assignment. There's one phone number assigned to that one line. When you look at the modern contact center, most of you, I'm going to hope, are voice over IP. Some of you stragglers might still be on PRIs, ISDN, whatever. But in either case, you don't have that one-to-one assignment of a phone number to a phone line. So at the federal level, we've been told for years, we need to have an accurate caller ID that the person can call back during business hours, talk to someone, or at least find out why they were called. I don't think they actually have to talk to a human, but they have to be able to find out why they were called. They have to be able to put on the do not call list. There's a lot of requirements around that. I think that we're still okay following that legislation or that kind of practice of thought. As I said earlier in this, a lot of people misread the bill and they said, okay, this is a new law, these are a new set of rules, et cetera, et cetera. But it's not. It's an amendment to the existing statutes. So if you look in the Florida statutes, granted, it is a separate section around sales, but there is verbiage that specifically gives an allowance for substituting the selling party's phone number and display information for your own, as long as you've got authorized to do that. So again, and that was, interestingly enough, in the same bill. So that part is left intact in that same bill. They made like a minor adjustment to the number of it. I think it went from 0.7 to 0.8 or 0.9 to 0.8, something like that. But it's 501.059, section 8, if you're interested. But it does have that in that same bill. So in that same bill, while it does have one section that says you can't try to conceal your identity, there's another section that says you can do that substitution as long as it's proper and all that. So you're probably safe there. Now, again, we could get really worried about caller ID, but again, I don't see this as being as bad as states like South Carolina, where they say, well, you can't use a caller ID in our state unless you've got a brick and mortar presence. So I would just say, again, follow best practices with your that you're doing at the federal level. Ensure all of your phone numbers can be dialed by the called party to find out who called, why they called, get put on your do not call list. If you're rotating through numbers, like if you're using the advanced caller ID handling in our system, if you're rotating through phone numbers, make sure all of them are valid and go through the CNAM resolution on those. Or I'm sorry, registration on those. And if you're not familiar with that, essentially that's a process where you reach out to your carrier, or if you're using a cloud system, you reach out to the cloud provider and say, hey, I want to make sure that, I'll just use the first one on the screen here, 219-555-1234. I want to make sure that's registered as Grupo NGN. That way, when the call comes up on the consumer's phone, it has number and name. And as always, regardless of what's going on with the registration or what caller IDs you're using, make sure you're using those abandoned messages for a dropped call. Make sure there's the opt-out options and so on. And before I go on, I want to make sure I clarify, because I'm not sure if I clarified this earlier. We talked about TCPA, and I made a pledge that I'm going to try not to mention TCPA too much, and I'm going to stick with that. One of the reasons I wanted to stay away from TCPA is because, again, people make that false correlation between TCPA and cell phones. The TCPA is about a lot more than that, and so is the Florida bill. And all these things I'm talking about apply to much more than cell phones. It's landlines as well. I did make and this is what made me think of it, I mentioned consumers. This applies to both consumers and businesses. So again, any Florida resident or Florida party, if you will. All right, so let's move on. Let's talk about limiting your attempts to 3 per 24-hour period. Should be pretty straightforward, but just let's think that through a little bit. In the past, we would typically have some kind of logic in place where we just say, based on the disposition, this is how soon I want to redial it. So like if I look on my screen here, if it's a ring no answer, I don't want to try them again for 4 hours. But if it's a busy signal, maybe I'm going to wait 12 hours. I remember back in the late 90s, early 2000s, if we had a busy signal, we tried again in 15 minutes because that told us, oh, somebody's home, somebody's on their phone. So let's keep trying them again over and over again, because hopefully they'll free up and take our call before they walk out the door. What you're going to want to do now is you're going to want to take a slightly different approach. So, again, if you're using our system, you've got our advanced redialing strategies. You may say, and I realize I saw this this morning on the slide, I've got these two arrows backwards, but, I say, is this the state of Florida? And you have that make that determination however it sees fit. And if it's Florida, put some sort of logic in for 3 attempts per day. Otherwise, do whatever is your standard logic. So some thought you could put behind that is, maybe I still want to try to do something creative, like if it's a busy signal, I want to try them in 15 minutes. If it's an answering machine, I want to try them in 4 hours. You could still do that. You could still exhaust your 3 attempts in a 24-hour period, all within a single hour. Just make sure then that you have logic in there that when it's making that reassignment, it's also taking into consideration how many times have I called them in the last 24 hours. So again, you can take all that into consideration when you're doing that, but again, this is doable. All right, so let's talk about the part that I think has everybody the most scared about this, or the most excited about this. And actually, I'm going to pause for a second here, because I do see Angela put something in the chat saying that you thought that only applies to calls that are for consumer/residential purposes by definition. So I'm not sure I completely understand that question. It applied to calls that are for consumer. Oh, no, I'm sorry, consumer/residential. No, I read in the bill, and again, I'll review that, and I can provide clarification to you offline, Angela, but I'm pretty sure this applies to any Florida number whatsoever. It might be consumer-based, but I think that's another area too where you would want to be careful. A great example of this is with lawyers. I have seen with a lot of legal firms, and in small business in general, but with a lot of legal firms, that the business number is also their personal number. So maybe they use their cell phone for both business and for personal usage. So the intent of your call may not be taken into consideration. So if you call them for B2B purposes, and they answer on that phone that they use for both business and personal, it may not matter that it was B2B. There is a lot in this bill that doesn't make sense. There's a lot in this bill that is somewhat contradictory. I know of a lot of people that are already filing motions to try to get things blocked, or saying, hey, this is a violation of this right, this right, this right. This contradicts federal regulation. I can go on and on. There's a lot of problems with it. So I don't think that's clear, but I would be happy to do some research offline. Angela, I think I've got your email, so I'll get back to you and let you know what I find. All right, so clicking, or the manual dial part, I think is a part that has everybody scared. Again, this is going to be one of those few times that I talk about TCPA, hopefully one of the last ones. The big debate with TCPA was around things like, or at least the cell phone part of it, was with, okay, well, what does it mean for manual dial? What does it mean for capability and things like that? Florida's, and I think while everybody went around with that, everybody said, okay, well, I can do click to dial. Click to dial is good enough. That's manual intervention. That's got human intervention. That's not an automated call, so everything's fine. Florida just threw a big twist into this. They introduced the term manual selection. So it's not about manual dialing anymore. I mean, that is part of it, but there's also manual selection. Now, what would I mean there? What's the difference? Think back to your TCPA solutions, your manual dialers. I'm going to call them that. Think back to your manual dialers that you were using. And many of you are still using. What would happen is your agent would get a screen pop, they'd click a button, and it would dial. And that met all the requirements. And then as soon as that call ended, boom, another call on their screen, click to dial, go. So the idea being that your agents were constantly working calls. Florida says you have to not only have manually dialed calls, but they have to be manually selected as well. So in this environment, what you have to do is your agent has to have the ability to manually select that record. So what does this mean? Does this mean we need to go back to Rolodexes and things like that? That's one idea. But I think we've got a few other ideas in place. So in our product, you can have custom manual dial screens. And this is something that has existed for at least a decade, probably longer. But you can have your own manual dial screens. And I know some of my customers have built their own in response to this. For those of you who haven't, if you're one of my current customers, reach out to the support team, just open a standard ticket. We'll give you this one. There's no cost for it. Otherwise, next time you get upgraded, this will be included in your update, just like any other new feature or new, standard option is free. This will be included with your next upgrade. The way we approach it, though, is when this manual search screen loads, is it gives the agent a list of leads to pick from. So it essentially gives the agent a window into the database of the leads. Now, I know a lot of you say, oh, well, I want to select by time zone. I want to sort by attempt. I want to filter for people who have, their favorite color is yellow, whatever. This takes all that into consideration. I'm not going to go into detail on that right now, but this can take all of that into consideration. So it applies all of your filters, your sorting logic, et cetera. But it gives your CSR a list of records to pick from. Now on my screen here, you'll see that I've given myself 5 to pick from. This is configurable. You can make it 2. You can make it 200. You could do whatever you want to do. But what you would do is you would split your Florida records into a separate campaign. And then when your agent comes in here and clicks search, they can find the record they want and they can select a button to manually dial them. Now, that hits the manual selection piece. In my opinion, that also handles manual dial. But if you say, well, we want it to be 2 separate mouse clicks, one where they select it and then a second one where they dial it. Okay, no problem. You can configure it. And this is all just campaign properties you can configure to where it will then dial that person through the second mouse click. Now, taking this a step further, you say, okay, well, wait a minute. If I'm giving my agent the ability to look into the list of leads and they can see, let's just say 5 leads, what's going to cause Johnny CSR and Jane CSR, or what's going to keep them, I should say, from dialing the same records? We do have protection code in here to where we make sure the leads we pull down for Johnny are going to be completely separate from the ones for Jane. If you take a much, much, much more conservative approach and you say, okay, well, I want to give them 200 records to pick from. The problem you could conceivably run into is that if you've got 10 agents and they've got 100 or 200 apiece, they could be eating up a large portion of your leads list. So we have our screen configured. And again, this is a configurable option to where those are only good for them for 5 minutes. After 5 minutes, everything expires. You can see on my screen, all the dial buttons are stale. They're grayed out. So they'll have to click search to check again. Likewise, once that agent clicks dial and they call that person, they're not able to call that person again until they show back up in their list. So they call them, and let's say you're doing 8-hour spread between your attempts to keep it even at 24 hours. They won't be able to call that person again, and that will come up on anybody's list of leads for at least 8 hours. So we try to cover all the bases there. Now, with this, again, this definitely only applies when you don't have express written consent. So I mentioned express written consent earlier, right? If you've got express written consent, you're okay to do your standard automatic dialing. So if you've got that, and I'm not going to go into what Florida law says is acceptable as express written consent. Again, that's where I would say speak with your legal team on that. But the advice I will give you is when you are doing express written consent, make sure you're doing proper record keeping exercises. Make sure that you've got a process for handling consent revocation. I didn't see something specific in the bill that talked about the ability for someone to revoke their consent, but I would operate under the assumption that that is allowed. And make sure that once the R&D, the reassigned number database is online, make sure that you still have that valid consent. I don't know if we have time to go into the R&D, so if you've got questions about that, you can save that for the end of this, or I did put a blog post on our website. It's here on the bottom of the slide, grupongn.com. You can go to our blog, and we've got a couple articles on what that is, how you can use it. But I think that's something that's going to be very important for anybody who is working in a consent-based environment. All right, so a couple last items, and then we're going to open it up for questions in about 4 minutes here or so. Does this affect inbound? we're talking about this, and I've even put this in some of the pieces that I've written on the subject. A lot of people, I think, are missing a potential problem with inbound, and that is around virtual hold. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with the term virtual hold, because I realize the different providers may have different names for the technology, virtual hold is where you call in and they say, your estimated wait time is 4 hours. If you don't want to stay on the call, press 1 to keep your place in queue, and we'll call you back when it's your turn. So you say, yeah, I'm not going to stay on the phone for 4 hours. You press 1, you're done. Most systems I've interacted with handle that callback to the party in one of two ways. Either one, it is through the IVR itself that you were in. You'll get a call and say, hi, I'm calling on behalf of, fill in the name of the company. I'm trying to reach Isaac in that really bad robotic voice. Press 1 if you still want to speak to someone. You press 1, and then you hear hold music. It finds an agent and gives them to you. That's an automatic dial. So in my opinion, unless you have found a way to get express written consent from them, and again, there might be ways to do that electronically in the state of Florida. I'm not going to provide advice on that. Unless you know that you've got bulletproof express written consent, that could be a loophole where someone could trick you. Likewise, I've seen other systems, and I don't see this as often, but the call goes to the agent and then it automatically dials. In our system, it can be configured to do that. I would recommend, if you've determined they're Florida, you don't do that. And you say, well, wait a minute, come on, they requested that callback. Yes, they did, but they didn't request that you did it automatically, unless, again, you've gotten that consent. And this is private right of action. So one of the last times I'll mention TCPA, probably can come up one more time, but with TCPA, there were all kinds of stories about people with the cell phone regulations that were going out and were making tons of money. Forbes ran an article on someone who made like $800,000 a year, supposedly, buying cell phones, getting phone numbers that have recently been returned, keeping them in a shoebox under their bed or in a circle on the floor. And every time somebody rang, it's like, okay, I'm going to sue. Okay, I'm going to sue, and going after that company. People saw that as a business model. So I don't expect it to be any different here. I think that the plaintiff's bar is very clever in how they can come after people who are trying to do things properly for money. So I would make sure that when you're doing this virtual hold, you're either having what constitutes or what meets the needs or the definition of express written consent, or simply just make sure if it's a Florida person, there's no automation in calling them back. All right, so last item I'm going to talk about here, and then I'll wrap it up, is do I need to have a separate system for Florida calling? And again, hopefully last time I ever mentioned TCPA today, when we were all talking about cell phones, there was that provision about capacity, current capacity and future capacity. And I don't think future capacity really became an issue anywhere, but I know present capacity did. I know that became a big issue for a lot of cases where they're saying, well, yeah, they called it manually, but it was from an auto dialer. The system itself was an auto dialer. Florida doesn't have that restriction. So if you're one of our customers that uses a single system, I know that's one of the big draws of us is we are truly all in one. So it's the same sign in for an agent for inbound, outbound chat, social media, SMS, email, whatever channel that agent is using, it's one application. They don't have to switch websites. They don't have to log out, log back in when they're changing channels, none of that. So for Florida, it would be the same thing. Your agents can still operate in a single environment, a single platform. And if you have split your leads out between manual campaigns and manual only campaigns, I should say, and the regular campaigns, there's no way for an agent to even accidentally call one of these records automatically. So you, in my opinion, on our platform, we're pretty safe. Obviously, you'd want to have, if you're not one of our customers, you'd want to have that discussion with your current provider. And that's it. So I finished that in a little bit less time than I expected. So we've got about 20 minutes left. We can open it up to Q&A. I see one person saying this is just limited to Florida numbers, right? Would these rules apply to Florida-based call centers dialing nationally? I love that it's an anonymous attendee that posted this, because I think that's how scared we all are, because it's like, oh, what if I've already broken the law? I don't want to admit anything. So yeah, no, I think that so first of all, I would apply this to any Florida number. So if you've got a Florida number, I would apply this to anybody. So meaning you're calling a Florida number. So when you ask, would these rules apply to Florida-based call centers dialing nationally? My understanding of the bill is that this applies to people you're calling in the state of Florida. So if your contact center is in Florida and you're calling Arizona, you don't have to worry about this for the people in Arizona you're calling. You just have to worry about it for the people in your state. Now, I would, again, caution on the address part. If you have their address and their address says that they're Florida, even though their phone number doesn't, just to be safe, I would take that step. Now, there's a lot of data hygiene services you can work with where you can look at, and again, we've got several as PACE members. You can work with them to try to do some sort of like 411 or some sort of reconciliation of your list where they could say, okay, this phone number matches this address and this does appear to be current. I think if you're taking those steps, it will help you. Michelle Schuster, who is PACE's general counsel, she loves to say, always be in a defendable position. So if you can show that you are, you had the address on file and it didn't say they're Florida, the phone number said they weren't Florida, and you did a 411 scrub on it and it wasn't Florida, that's the best effort you could take. But the reverse side of that is if you've got a Florida address but a Phoenix phone number, I would recommend you treat it as Florida and you call it during those, or you apply these new limitations to it. Other questions? I see there's a Q&A bubble and there's also a chat bubble, so feel free to put those in either. All right, well, there might not be any more questions. So, again, I would say that if you are concerned that your provider doesn't have this capability, if you have follow-up questions you want to talk to me about, obviously I know that there was the question about this applying to consumers or businesses only, or I'm sorry, consumers only versus consumers and businesses, and I will double check that. If you've got any other questions, feel free to reach out to me. And again, make sure you've got a good advisor for the legal aspects of this. Don't take the word of just a guy doing a webinar. Obviously, make sure that you're doing your own fact checking and make sure you're holding your vendors accountable. So if they say they've got a solution that meets these needs, make sure you're double checking their homework. So Casey, I'll put it back to you.
All right. Well, thanks everyone for joining us, and thank you to Isaac and Grupo NGN for sponsoring this session. We did record it, and so the recording will be on the PACE website in just a couple of days, and we'll send you an email too. But as Isaac said, if you do think of questions later, please reach out to him, or if you don't have his contact information, you can reach out to me and I'll pass that along. Otherwise, hope you have a great day, and we hope to see you at a PACE event soon. Thanks so much.
Thank you, guys.